Hello, welcome to Love to Programming. I am Kausar. This is session 3 of Complete FMS using C# and SQL Server. In today's session, we are going to implement Finance Management System ERD using SQL Server. However, before watching this video, I strongly recommend you to watch session 2 of this video series, because in session 2 we explained Finance Management System ERD. Okay, let's open SQL Server 2014. Here, first we want to create database. To create database using SQL Server, we will use create database command. Here I am going to provide meaningful name for the database, for example FMS database. After that we want to put go statement here, because we want to execute many statements at a time. After that we want to create tables. First, we want to create faculty table. To create table using SQL Server, we will use create table command. For example, TBL faculty. Inside the parentheses, we want to add columns for the table. First, we want to add faculty ID column. For example, integer primary key. And to make this column identity, we want to add the identity command. Let's add faculty title column as well. For example, varchar 64. And for this column, we want to apply unique constraint. And to make this column not null, we want to add not null constraint. After that, we want to add the abbreviation column. For example, varchar 16. Then we want to add the description column. For example, varchar 128. After that, we want to put another go statement here. Okay, thereafter we want to create semester table. Simple. Create table. For example, TBL semester. Semester also has semester ID column. For example, integer primary key and identity. And semester also has semester title column. For example, varchar 64 unique and not null. Then we want to add the abbreviation column as well. For example, varchar 16. After that, we want to add the description column. For example, varchar 128. After that, we want to put one go statement here. Then we want to create student table. Simple. Create table. For example, TBL student. Student has student ID column. For example, integer primary key and identity. Student also has student name column. For example, varchar 64 and not null. Let's add father name column as well. For example, varchar 64 not null. Hereafter, we want to add the gender column. For example, varchar 10 and not null. After that, we want to add faculty ID column, because this table has relationship with faculty table. Simple. Faculty ID, for example, integer. After that, we want to add fees column. For example, float and not null. After that, we want to add discount column as well. For example, float. Thereafter, we want to add phone number column. For example, varchar 14 and unique. For storing email address, we want to add email column as well. For example, varchar 32 and unique. Then we want to add family member column. For example, varchar 64. And to store family member phone number, we want to add family member phone column. For example, varchar 14 and unique. And to store image of the student, we want to add put column. And type of this column must be image. That is because we want to store actual image in the database. Thereafter, we want to add the description column. For example, varchar 128. Good. Thereafter, we want to establish relationship between student and faculty table. To achieve this, we want to add constraint. Let's provide meaningful name for the constraint. For example, table student, student ID, and foreign key. For example, faculty ID. This faculty ID is available in student table. After that, we want to add the faculty table as well. Simple references. For example, TBL faculty ID. This faculty ID comes from faculty table. Well, after that we want to put another go statement here, and then we want to create student fees table. Simple create table. For example, TBL student fees. The student fees table has student fees ID. Simple student fees ID. For example, integer primary key and identity. And then we have student ID because this table has relationship with student table. After that, we have semester ID as well because this table has relationship with semester table. Let's add fees year column as well. For example, small int not null. And then we will add the date column as well. Simple fees date. For example, date not null. Thereafter, we want to add total fees column. For example, float and not null. And then we want to add fees amount column. For example, float and not null. Let's add the description column as well. For example, varchar 128. To save some time, we want to copy this statement from student table. And then we want to paste it here. And here we want to change only the constant name. Simple table student fees. And then we want to change the foreign key as well. Student ID. And here we want to change the table name as well. Simple table student. And here we want to change the column as well. Student ID. Let's change the second constraint as well. Simple table semester ID FK. Here we want to remove faculty ID. Simple. We want to add the semester ID. And then we want to add the reference table as well. Simple TBL semester. Let's add semester column ID as well. Simple semester ID. Thereafter, we want to add another go statement here. So after that, we want to create the account table. Simple create table TBL account. Account has account ID. For example, integer primary key and identity. Account also has account name. For example, varchar 64 unique and not null. Then we want to add the balance column. For example, money not null. Then we want to add the available balance column. For example, money and not null. Good. After that, we want to add the description column as well. For example, varchar 128. And then we want to add go statement here. After that, we want to create the deposit table structure. Simple create table TBL deposit. Deposit table has deposit ID column. For example, int primary key and identity. And this table has a relationship with account table. Let's add account ID. For example, int. Then we want to add the amount column. For example, money and not null. After that, we want to add the date column. Simple date. For example, date not null. And then we want to add the description column as well. For example, varchar 128 Okay, after that we want to establish relationship between account and deposit table. Simple constraint. For example, TBL deposit account ID FK foreign key account ID. Okay, account ID references to TBL account and account ID. Okay, here we want to correct the small spelling mistake. After that we want to add go statement here. Here we want to create the withdraw table. Simple, create table, for example TBL withdraw. This table is very similar to deposit table. Let's copy this whole script from here. And then we want to paste this script inside the withdraw table. Here first we want to change this ID column. Simple, withdraw ID. After that we want to change this constraint name as well. Simple withdraw. Okay, very good. After that we want to put another go statement here. And then we want to create the teacher table structure. Simple, create table TBL teacher. Teacher has teacher ID column, for example int primary key and identity. Then we want to add the first name column, first name, for example worker 64 not null. Let's add the last name as well. Simple last name, for example worker 64 not null. Then we want to add the father name column. Simple father name, for example worker 64 and not null. After that we want to add gender, for example worker 10 and not null. Then we want to add teacher degree column. Simple degree, for example worker 32 and not null. After that we want to add net salary column. Simple net salary, for example float and not null. Then we want to add phone number column, for example worker 14 and unique. For teacher email address we want to add email address as well. Simple email, for example worker 32 and unique. Then we want to add faculty ID column, for example int, because teacher table has relationship with faculty table. After that we want to add the photo column as well. Simple photo, for example image. And then we want to add the description column, for example worker 128. After that we want to establish relationship between faculty and teacher table. Simple constraint, for example table teacher faculty ID FK foreign key faculty ID references TBL faculty ID. After that we want to put go statement here. And then we want to create teacher advancillary table. Simple create table TBL teacher. Okay, teacher advancillary. This table has teacher advancillary ID column, for example int primary key and identity. To establish relationship between teacher and teacher advancillary, we want to add teacher ID as a foreign key. Then we want to add month column as well. Simple EDV month, for example worker 32 and not null. Thereafter we want to add year column. Simple EDV year, for example small int not null. And then we want to add amount column, simple amount, for example float, and not null. After that we want to add date column, for example date, not null. After that we want to add account ID column because this table has a relationship with account table. And then we want to add the description column, for example varchar 128. After that we want to establish relationship. First we want to establish relationship between teacher and teacher advancillary table. Simple constraint, for example table teacher advancillary teacher ID FK foreign key teacher ID references to TBL teacher ID. Then we want to establish relationship between teacher advancillary table and account table. Simple constraint, for example table teacher advancillary account ID FK foreign key account ID reference to TBL account ID. After that we want to put go statement here. And then we want to create teacher payroll table. Simple create table TBL teacher payroll. This table has teacher payroll ID, for example and primary key and identity. Also has a relationship with teacher table. Let's add teacher ID as a foreign key, for example end. Then we want to add payroll month column, for example varchar 32 not null. And then we want to add payroll year column, for example small int not null. After that we want to add amount column, for example float not null. Thereafter we want to add paid by column, simple paid by, for example varchar 64. After that we want to add payment date column, for example date not null. Okay, after that we want to add payment status column, for example varchar 14 and not null. Then we want to add account ID column as well, for example int well. After that we want to add the description column as well, for example varchar 128. Good. After that we want to establish their relationships. This table also has a relationship with teacher and account table. I'm gonna copy relationship from teacher advancillary table. And here I'm gonna change only the constraint names. Simple table teacher payroll. Let's change the second constraint name as well to payroll. After that we want to put go statement here. And for creating staff table we want to copy structure of the teacher table, because staff table is very similar to teacher table. Here, first we want to change their name from teacher to staff. After that we want to change this ID to staff ID. Thereafter we want to change this constraint name as well, table staff. Okay, after that we want to put go statement here. And for creating staff advancillary table, we want to copy teacher advancillary table structure. Here first we want to change their name, table, staff, Advancillary, and then we want to change this ID to staff ID, and here we want to change their constant names as well. Simple table staff. Let's remove this teacher ID. Instead of this we want to add staff ID, and here we want to add staff table staff. Let's add staff ID as well as a primary key. After that we want to change this constant name as well. Simple table staff. Okay, thereafter we want to create payroll table. For creating this table structure we want to copy teacher payroll table structure. First we want to change their name to table staff payroll. Thereafter we want to change this column as well. Staff payroll ID. After that we want to change this firing key as well into staff ID. And here we want to change constant name. Simple. Instead of teacher we want to add staff name. After that we want to add staff ID as well. And here we want to add the reference table as well. Table staff. Okay. After that we want to add staff ID column as well. After that we want to change another constant name. Simple table staff. Okay, thereafter we want to create expense table structure. Simple create table expense. This table has expense ID, for example and primary key and identity. Then we have the title column, for example worker 64 not null. Then we want to add the quantity column, for example small and not null. After that we want to add unit price column, for example float not null. Let's add total price column as well, for example float not null. Okay, thereafter we want to add expense date column as well, for example date not null. After that we want to add staff ID column as a firing key, and then we want to add account ID as a firing key, because expense table has a relationship with account table and staff table. Then we want to add the description column, for example worker 128. Okay, after that we want to establish their relationships. For saving some time, I want to copy this relationship. Here just I want to change their constant name. Simple table expense staff ID FK. Let's change the second constant name as well. Simple table expense. Good. After that we want to put go statement here, and then we want to create role table structure. Simple create table role. The role table has two columns, role ID and role name. First we want to add role ID column. Simple role ID integer primary key and identity. Then we want to add role name column. Simple role name worker, for example 32 not null and unique. After that you want to put go statement here. Then we want to create function table structure. Simple create table, for example table function. First we want to add function ID column. Simple function ID, for example int primary key and identity. Then we want to add form name column. Simple form name, for example worker 64 not null and unique. Let's add the display name column as well. Simple display name, for example worker 64 not null and unique. Okay, thereafter we want to add go statement here. and then we want to create function role table structure. Simple. Create table, for example table function role. First we want to add the ID column. Simple. Function role ID, for example int primary key and identity. Here first we want to add the role ID. Simple. Role ID int, and then we want to add the function ID. Simple. Function ID. Okay, function ID int. Thereafter we want to establish the relationships. Simple. Constraint table function role ID fk foreign key role ID references to table role. Okay, table role ID. After that we want to establish relationship between function and function role table. Simple. Constraint table function role function ID fk foreign key function ID. Okay, function ID references to table function ID. Good. After that we want to put another go statement here, and then we want to create user table structure. Simple. Create table user. This table has user ID, for example int primary key and identity. Then we have username column, for example varchar 32 not null and unique. Let's add password column as well. Simple. Password, for example varchar 32 not null. After that we want to add role ID column as well, for example int. That is because this table has relationship with role table. Okay, for establishing the relationship we want to copy this statement from here. Here just I want to change constraint name. Simple. table user. Okay, after that we want to execute the whole script by pressing the execute button. Okay, you can see the message command completed successfully. Here I am going to the Solution Explorer. I want to expand databases folder. You can see FMS database is created. Let's expand it. Here you can see all the tables available in FMS database. Okay, if you want to get this script, you can get this script from the video description link. However, end of this lecture. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.